September 18, 1918. A British general stood watching Australian troops get ready for combat and made a remark he would later regret deeply. He said these men did not look like Australians. They looked like something that should be driven off the battlefield at bayonet point. What he saw in front of him were the dirtiest, most undisciplined-looking soldiers he had encountered in 4 years of war. Their uniforms were thick with mud. They lounged in shell holes instead of standing upright. Some had no boots at all. They looked more like outlaws than trained troops. What this general could not have known was that in just 73 hours, these same men would achieve what the entire British Empire had failed to accomplish over 4 years. They would shatter the Hindenburg Line, the strongest defensive system ever constructed in human history. They would do it so quickly and efficiently that German commanders would spend decades trying to understand how it happened. Here is what makes the story astonishing. The very reason these soldiers appeared so terrible was the exact reason they succeeded where everyone else had failed. And this is the story of how men who repulsed their own allies became the most effective fighting force on the Western Front. The man watching them was British General Henry Rawlinson, commander of the Fourth Army. He had led troops through the Somme and Passchendaele and survived years of industrial slaughter. He believed deeply in discipline, order, and what professional soldiers should look like. But what he saw near the village of Bellinglis in northern France did not match that image. Troops preparing for the assault were from the Australian 3rd and 5th Divisions. Rawlinson turned to his aide and gave a scathing assessment. The aide, Captain Edmund Herring, who had worked closely with Australians for 18 months, said nothing. He knew something the general did not, because everything Rawlinson interpreted as failure was actually tactical. Brilliance. The filthy uniforms were not neglect, they were camouflage. Australian soldiers had learned something British doctrine never considered. Clean uniforms reflected sunlight, and German snipers could spot them from hundreds of meters away. Mud-stained uniforms blended perfectly into the churned landscape of the Western Front. The math was simple. Soldiers who stayed clean died, soldiers who stayed dirty lived. Apparent lack of discipline was not chaos, it was flexibility. British doctrine demanded rigid formations and strict obedience. Australian doctrine allowed initiative at every level. If a corporal saw a better route, he took it. If a private saw an opportunity, he acted immediately. To British observers, this looked disorganized. On the battlefield, it meant Australians adapted faster than any enemy response. Men lying in shell craters were not resting. They were studying the terrain. They memorized every fold of ground, every drainage line, every sight angle. They learned to read the battlefield like a map. When the attack began, they moved through it as if they had lived there for years. The barefoot soldiers were preparing for close combat. Mud-filled boots weighed kilograms and slowed movement. Bare feet gripped wet duckboards better and allowed silent movement through trenches. It looked primitive, but it was brutally effective now. You need to understand the man leading them. Lieutenant General John Monash represented everything the British military elite distrusted. He was Jewish in an army, still casually anti-Semitic. He was a civil engineer, not a career officer from elite schools. He earned his rank through colonial militia service, not family connections. He spoke with an Australian accent. British officers disliked. Worst of all, he questioned doctrine. Instead of accepting it, British staff officers opposed his promotion. They said he lacked the right background. They claimed his engineering mindset made him unfit for command. They even implied his religion was an issue, but the British Empire was running out of options, and the target Monash was about to attack explained why. Hindenburg Line was not a single trench. It was 200 kilometers of layered fortifications, Germany's final hope. Engineers spent 2 years building what they believed was an unbreakable system. Multiple trench lines separated by vast distances. Deep concrete bunkers immune to artillery. Machine gun nests with overlapping fire covering every approach. Barbed Wire belts up to 30 meters deep at its core, near Bellenglise, lay the St. Quentin Canal. 18 meters wide, 10 meters deep, fortified, with concrete pillboxes and machine gun positions on both banks. Elite Prussian Guard divisions defended it. German commanders believed it could not fall. Their confidence was justified. In April 1917, French forces lost over 100,000 men attacking the line and failed British assaults later that year achieved nothing despite massive bombardments. The Germans believed any attacker would be destroyed before reaching the first trench. Monash studied every failure and chose to do the opposite. British doctrine demanded days of artillery bombardment. Monash rejected it, saying it destroyed surprise, churned the ground into mud, and failed to eliminate strong defenses. Instead, he planned a short, violent bombardment, timed exactly with the infantry advance. British doctrine treated tanks as independent breakthrough weapons. Monash integrated them directly with infantry, moving at walking pace, destroying machine gun positions as they appeared. British doctrine relied on massive formations. Monash used small, fast-moving groups, exploiting gaps in terrain. British doctrine's centralized authority. Monash gave junior commanders freedom to adapt instantly. British staff officers predicted disaster. They said artillery was insufficient formations, too spread out, command too loose. Monash ignored them, as he had since Gallipoli. His men were alive because of it. On September 18th, while Rawlinson expressed disgust, Monash briefed his troops, and this shocked British officers. He explained not just orders, but the entire plan and purpose. British doctrine forbade this. Monash treated soldiers as thinking adults. The Australians knew about the canal, the bunkers, the machine guns, and the Prussian guards. They knew others had failed for years. They knew their plan was different. They did not know their own ally believed them unfit. September 29, 1918, at 5:50 a.m., the morning was cold and foggy, visibility barely 50 meters. German sentries saw nothing unusual. No long bombardment, no obvious preparations. At exactly 5:50 a.m. 1600, artillery guns fired at once. Not a day-long barrage, but a precise 12-minute strike on carefully selected targets. At 6:02 a.m. the barrage moved forward 200 meters. At that moment, Australian infantry advanced. What followed proved Rawlinson completely wrong. The fog became a weapon German gunners could not see Australians until they were within 30 meters. By then, tanks were destroying gun positions. Australians advanced in small groups, exactly as trained, bypassed strong points, attacked from the flanks, used grenades, rifles, and bayonets. German defenders faced enemies appearing from impossible directions, moving with shocking speed and flexibility. German doctrine could not respond. The St. Quentin Canal fell in 4 hours. After years of failure, it was breached in a single morning. Australian engineers used collapsible bridges and ladders. Diversionary attacks fixed German attention elsewhere. Assault teams crossed at unexpected points, hidden by fog. By 10 a.m. both banks were secured. Counterattacks failed repeatedly. Elite Prussian Guard units could not dislodge them. Every attack met coordinated fire from machine guns, rifles, and artillery, directed by forward observers. Communicating with unprecedented speed. By nightfall, the Australians advanced over 5 kilometers. They captured more than 4,000 prisoners. They seized 76 artillery guns. They broke the Hindenburg Line across an 8-kilometer front. There, casualties were around 1,260 killed and wounded. This defied everything military theory predicted. British forces lost 60,000 at the Somme, without a breakthrough. French forces lost 100,000 in the naval offensive, with nothing to show. The Hindenburg Line was stronger than any previous position. Australians broke it in one day. Rawlinson arrived the next day to verify reports. What he saw left him speechless. Australians held ground 6 kilometers beyond the line. Prisoners were processed in overwhelming numbers. Captured guns were firing on retreating German's Rawlinson formally apologized to Monash. He admitted he had misjudged both the men and their commander. He recommended Monash for immediate knighthood, but this mattered far beyond one battle. The breakthrough triggered the 100 Days offensive that ended the war. Over 6 weeks, Australians led the advance across France. They captured Peronne, Mont Saint Quentin, dozens of fortified villages. They sustained momentum other forces had failed to maintain since 1914. The numbers are extraordinary. Australians were about 10% of Allied strength. They captured 29,000 prisoners, nearly a quarter of the total. They captured 338 artillery pieces, over 1/5 of all German guns lost. They advanced faster, suffered fewer casualties, and achieved more decisive results than any comparable force. Was not greater courage. All aid soldiers were brave. This was superior tactics, leadership, and culture. The filthy soldiers Rawlinson despised had something more valuable than polish and drill. They had initiative, flexibility, and practical intelligence. They had leaders who trusted them to think German. General Erich Ludendorff later wrote that the September 29th breakthrough convinced him Germany had lost. The line was meant to hold until 1919. Its collapse in one day destroyed that plan. He specifically noted Australian speed, flexibility, and execution. The Hindenburg Line fell not because Australians looked professional, but because they fought professionally. They understood war is not parade ground order. War is mud, blood, improvisation, and decisions under fire. The dirty diggers understood this. Rawlinson learned it the hard way. Sometimes the dirtiest soldiers are the most effective. Sometimes those who break every rule win the war. And sometimes appearance matters least of all on the battlefield.